Dr. Irving Finkel is a philologist, an Assyriologist, and a storyteller with a cult following. He's the assistant keeper of ancient Mesopotamian script, languages and culture in the British Museum. And he's one of the few people who can read cuneiform inscriptions on clay tablets from ancient Mesopotamia. So, Dr. Finkel, thank you very much indeed for joining me today.
I'm glad to be here, sir.
Ancient Mesopotamia is not a typical kind of subject that one comes across at school or is taught normally in standard education. So can I ask, to begin with, how did you get interested in such a, let's say, a rarefied subject, esoteric subject even, maybe?
Well, it's quite true what you say about school. From what I know of it, from teachers and friends, kids sometimes do the Romans and then they do the Romans again. And sometimes they do the Egyptians, but they don't do much else. And then they move on to the more important parts of the world. So Mesopotamia and its languages and its literature and so forth often is relegated to the shades and the back seat of the cinema, so to speak. But I'm always battling to change all this because it is very fascinating and very important in the whole stream of the humanities. And what happened to me was, it was a kind of two-part thing because I grew up in a family where going to the British Museum was a normal activity. And I went a lot and decided quite early on that I wanted to work in the British Museum when I grew up, if I got round to doing that. And that was the first prong of the thing. And the second thing is I was interested from a quite young age in what you might call difficult writing or funny writing, not the boring old alphabetic stuff, but all the other things. And so I went through a phase of wanting to do Egyptology because I thought hieroglyphs are fascinating, but by accident, all that stopped. Because when I went to university and started off hieroglyphic with the teacher there, he died after the first day. And there I was, shipwrecked, and the professor said, well, you could do a bit of cuneiform. We have a very good teacher here. So I knocked on the door and said, hello, and he wasn't very pleased, but anyway, he took me on. So I started with him learning about cuneiform writing. And after a couple of days, I decided this was my life's work. So by being buffeted around by unexpected fortuity, I found myself on track to become an Assyriologist and full of desire to work in the British Museum. And both those things are highly rarefied, as you say. And to pull off both at once was really very fortunate. But I applied to the British Museum at a certain moment when they were looking for someone, a new person to read cuneiform, and I got the job. And I've been there ever since. So I've had a charmed life, really. And what happened was when I first met into cuneiform writing, I didn't know much more about it than anybody else. But somehow it struck a strong chord in me. So I never had any trouble learning the signs, which there's about 1,000, and all different shapes from different periods. I never had any trouble with that. And the language, the grammar and thing, it just seemed to me to be kind of familiar. So it wasn't like struggling to penetrate a completely new field. You have to learn all the ropes and everything. It just kind of worked. And I had a brilliant teacher, this Wilfrid Lambert, and most of the time it was one-to-one. This is a very unusual thing in British universities because all my friends did German or history when there were 40 or 50 people in the classroom and you could hide anonymously and spend time reading your mobile if you already had one, because they didn't in those days. But it was like that. So you were anonymous and nobody swiveled around and said, and you answer the question in the middle of a lecture. But I was stark naked in front of this penetrating Sherlock Holmes person who was merciless, critical, sarcastic, and exceptionally brilliant. And so I had to prepare everything. I had to shine and do things up to scratch. Otherwise, it was so embarrassing. So I had a hothouse training with the best Assyriologists in Europe, one-to-one. I learned to read Sumerian and Babylonian and the different periods of the script and the different kinds of literature. And he sent me out in the world equipped to be an Assyriologist with the necessary tools. And then I got a job in Chicago, which is another marvelous thing when I came home I got the job in the BM. So really, if I did something in the last life, it must have been very meritorious after what's happened to me since. I'm a very fortunate person, and I've been in the BM since 1979, although I try to keep this to myself because I'm scared that somebody will look something up and say, excuse me, we want your ruler and chair back. So I tend to skulk carefully out of sight.
Well, I believe they can't get rid of you now simply for old age anymore. They used to be able to do that kind of thing. But
They
as you,
did, and they did it very liberally in the old days. So you have to be not non-senile and fit. So I've taken to this new idea, which is to run up the 2 flights of stairs from the ground floor to my office at top speed, looking like I'm 18 and full of vitality, go into my room, lie down on the floor and pant for 20 minutes until I've recovered. But don't tell anybody that.
I won't. All right. Well, thank you. As you say, Assyriologists are not easy to come by. I've only ever known one other Assyriologist in my short, well, longish life now, and that was a guy called DJ Wiseman, who I got
Oh,
to know once
yes,
or twice. He was at
yes,
SOAS around the corner from me. I used to be at Birkbeck College, not far from the British Museum itself.
right,
And I
right.
used to visit the British Museum on almost a daily basis because I
I'm
would use
glad
it.
to hear that, sir. I'm
I would
glad to.
use it. I would use it as a cut through to go from
Oh,
one
I
side
see.
to the other. And
There
that
is
was
that.
on that was the days before they had these incredibly long queues, which they have now.
Yes,
Beforehand, you could just walk straight in, walk straight out again, and it was fantastic. And you could drop by and look at Leonardo's pictures on the way. But
exactly.
um, but nowadays it's much more difficult getting in and out. But anyway,
Yes,
um, so you've lived a charmed life because you can do the very thing which you want to do, which most people, maybe 99% of people, never get a chance of doing. They have to do a job which unfortunately they often dislike. And I
this
think,
is so true. I know. Yes.
but let's pin down the subject itself now and be a little bit um, defining about it.
Right.
When we talk about Mesopotamia,
Hmm.
where exactly do we mean? I mean, I only have the kind of general idea of between two rivers, Tigris and Euphrates. And
That's the
having
main
pinned it
thing.
down
Yes.
geographically, can we pin it down chronologically? From what
We can do
period
both.
to what period are we talking about?
Right. We can do both. Well, as you say, it's the between the Euphrates and Tigris place, which is it's more or less the same geographical area as modern Iraq, more or less the same. So if you know about where Iraq is and what it looks like, it's the same terrain, but it's about the same dimension, so to speak. Well, the thing is, it used to be called the Fertile Crescent because they knew in Mesopotamia how to harness water to irrigate land which was otherwise sterile. And this was discovered very early on, of course. So it became a kind of breadbaskety area when things were going well. And people came in, they were attracted to Mesopotamia from the outside. But the modern study of that part of the world, it really falls into different categories because you have prehistory with the Neolithic and that kind of stuff before writing, when the beginnings of cities and all that kind of thing. But I myself work in the area when writing came into being. So you have a long period of time with different populations coming and settling, sharing, intermarrying, sharing their languages long before there's any evidence of writing. But by about 3,500 BC, something like that, um, writing gradually made its appearance within the society that lived in those cities in Mesopotamia. So there are various simple and interesting things about it. The first thing is that the writing itself began as pictographs, which couldn't really convey proper language. They were pictures of a simple kind that all children understand. But there was a massive jump whereby it was realized that what started out as picture signs could be used to write sounds. And when they had this idea, it became possible to record language in such a way that another person could read it back. So by about 3,300 BC, this was up and running. And the paradox is that they used for their writing support not paper or wood or leather as many other persons. They used clay from the riverbanks, these same rivers, which turned out to be a marvelous material because they press the signs into the clay, but unless something disastrous happened, these tablets lasted forever. They dried in the air, they got buried, sometimes they were baked. So they survive in huge quantity and indiscriminately. So we have things written by kings and judges, very serious matters, and we have poetry, and we have dictionaries and medicine and magic. But also we have private letters and secret notes and more or less all the things that people use writing for generally, in principle. And there were two languages that were flourished among the populations, two unrelated languages which both use the same writing system. So if you go to university and learn to read and write cuneiform with your strict teacher who beats you, you have to learn the Sumerian language, its grammar and vocabulary, and the Babylonian language and its grammar and vocabulary, which are both written in identical script. So when you see a clay tablet for the first time, even if you are just nipping through the British Museum to get out the other side, you cannot tell whether they're in Sumerian or Babylonian until you read them. And it's a funny script because it's 1,000,000 miles away from alphabetic, which is what is largely used in the world today, although not by any means everybody, because the Chinese write in a rather similar way to Mesopotamia even today. But it's a cumbersome script to learn. You have to really work hard and to master it, to have all the stuff in your head, so that you.
I've got your book on cuneiform. Is it
Sorry?
cuneiform? How do you pronounce it?
Well, most people say cuneiform, but we always say cuneiform because of the etymology of the word, because it derives from cuneus, which is wedge in Latin. And when you look at the signs, it's a funny thing. They're made up of individual strokes of a stylus at different angles and different sizes. And the point is that the writing was not done on as with a biro on a sheet of paper, but by pressing the end of the stylus into the clay to make these very strokes. So it's a kind of printing in a sense. And the fact is that the end of the stylus, cut as it was, each application displaced a space in the clay, a bit like a piece of brie cheese, a kind of wedge shape. And that was an incidental function of the impression. So when they first saw the wedges, sometimes on stone, large scale, or small tablets, the salient point was that all the bits were cuneiform, they were wedge-shaped. And this was a time when a new phenomenon was given a name in Latin or Greek if there was nothing equivalent in English. And so they called it cuneiform, and it's predominated ever since.
Cuneiform, I say, I've got your book on cuneiform, and which is a very interesting introduction to the script, to the language. And what strikes me is makes it more difficult, certainly for someone like myself, to try to grapple with, is the fact it's very difficult to delineate between, I mean, in English it's letters. I don't know if
Yes.
it's phonetics in cuneiform, but you have to delineate and say that's one block, that's another one, that's the next one, that's
Yes.
the next one. And
Yes.
I find that hard to draw the lines between where you move from one to another.
I can fully imagine that. It's only a matter of spending 6 or 7 years being beaten that develops the facility. But one of the devilish things about the cuneiform writing system is that scribes never left a space between words. They wrote them in a continuum, so that when you start to read, it is quite a suicidal matter for despair for quite a long time, until one day you get the hang of it, and then your eye running along doesn't confuse half of one sign with the beginning of the next sign, but you suddenly get it. And I don't know whether if we reintroduced it into school, which is, of course, what I always wanted to do, whether all the kids will get their GCSEs first time round writing in cuneiform. But it is a functional system, and once you get into it, then it becomes quite natural. There are a couple of things about it. One, apart from not leaving any gaps, so you have to use your brain, each sign has more than one value. So it's just like the alphabet. A is A, B is B, but a given sign has more than one meaning, more than one value, and all sorts of other things. So when you first look at it, you think that these guys went out of their way to be as uncooperative as possible. But in fact, there's a great deal of beauty about the writing system and the signs themselves. And once you're in it, nothing is ever the same again. And it becomes the most natural thing in the world. It is a curious matter also, apropos of this, that the Sumerian and Akkadian Babylonian languages, which, as I say, are written in the same writing, are completely unrelated languages. So they are no more similar, Sumerian to Babylonian, than, say, French to Japanese. And if you imagine reading Japanese in Japanese script and French in Japanese script, it would be something like that. So, and the two languages which were completely separate in the education system formed a kind of symbiosis, and the kids who studied, who learned, had to learn the vocabulary in Babylonian and in Sumerian, and they studied grammar. They accepted sentences and gave names to the grammatical parts in the most sophisticated way in the second millennium already. So it's a very literate literary culture. And what we have is little short of miraculous sometimes, the interesting things that come out of clay tablets.
My little knowledge of Mesopotamia is that there are three kingdoms here: Sumeria, Assyria, and Babylonia. But you only talk about two languages. What happened to the Assyrian version? Isn't there an Assyrian version?
That's a fair question. So Sumerian is, so to speak, the oldest. And then we get the Assyrians and the Babylonians concurrently. That is to say, the Assyrians are in the north, like Scotland, and the Babylonians are in the south, like England. And the language which the Assyrians and Babylonians speak is called Akkadian. And Akkadian is one tongue with these two dialects. It's a bit like the Scottish English affair. So that if you spoke Assyrian, for example, and you met a Babylonian at the bus stop, you could have a comfortable conversation, even though you might privately snigger at the pronunciations and the strange forms, but it will be something like that. So the Akkadian language, which is Babylonian and Sumerian, Babylonian and Assyrian, is a Semitic tongue. So it is related to the modern Semitic languages like Hebrew and Arabic and Syriac and Aramaic, all that lot. There's several big Semitic languages, which of course are still alive, but the Babylonian tongue is extinct, and so is the Sumerian tongue. So it was a matter in the 19th century when they first got the inscriptions to penetrate, break into the signs and get the words out from underneath, which is a tour de force by some very clever persons. But now people can read Akkadian, or that's to say Babylonian or Assyrian, with perfect facility. And if you have a tablet which is in respectable condition, a proper Assyriologist should be able to read a Babylonian letter more or less at sight, like a violinist reading a string quartet part. With Sumerian, it's a little more difficult because the language doesn't have the comforting fact that it's got lots of modern relatives. So if you've done Arabic or Hebrew or any of those tongues, and then you look at ancient Babylonian, you're already on the same page with them. You understand the T is the feminine, you can see the plural, you can see prepositions, you can see all sorts of things from the other languages which are accessible, as if, for example, if you do Latin and Spanish and French, you have the same kind of situation. But with Sumerian, there isn't any of that help. It's on its own. It might as well have come from the moon. And the only help that we have is that in the schools and in the later colleges, a bit like a university where there was advanced study, the scholars who worked in these things translated Sumerian into Akkadian. Sometimes they made bilingual texts with interlinear translations, and they compiled dictionaries of the words, because Sumerian began to recede into the darkness and wasn't spoken on the streets, and it became eventually a matter for learned writing, a bit like Latin later on, of course. And but so the Babylonian speaking or Syrian scribes created for themselves resources to facilitate life which have been indispensable for the modern scholar. Their dictionaries are our dictionaries, and their grammars are our grammars.
Wow. So, I mean, you've mentioned different Semitic languages and also the cuneiform. what's the primacy here? Did one come before the other, or did
Ah,
Hebrew come first, or they all contemporaneous? Which began?
well, that is
Um,
a very thorny question. I mean, there
ah,
are two approaches. One is that when you look at ancient things, you look at the earliest one and then the next earliest, and so you have a kind of sense of internal chronology, so that Hebrew doesn't become known to us earlier than Babylonian, for example, because there are people speaking some kind of Babylonian about 2,900 already. So that was there then. And
but
then,
haven't we found some old
yes,
pre kind of Hebrew? What
yes,
about the um, fifth
but
century,
much older than that. There's
fifth millennium? Sorry, back.
fifth millennium, no. There's no writing in the world which can be securely dated by anybody before about 3,500
Right.
BC.
Okay.
So sometimes people make exaggerated claims, but for Hebrew, because we start off with the Hebrew Bible, but there are Hebrew inscriptions from about 1,000 BC, native Hebrew inscriptions from Israel, Palestine, part of the world. Um, but we can't show the existence of Hebrew before that, even though, of course, it must have done. But the situation is that you have languages which are related, obviously, anybody can see, in a kind of sideways family tree or even a proper family tree, but it's difficult to see what really happened. So, for example, if you take French, Latin, Spanish, Italian, they are all Indo-European languages. And when you compare them, you can see that one is closer to another one in one respect and another one in another respect. And so you can see they have a common ancestry. And in the old days, it used to be believed that there was a proto-language, like Proto-Indo-European or Proto-Semitic, and that somehow appeared as a fait accompli in the world, and then all the other ones grew out of it downwards, spreading out in an evolutionary way. But nobody, I think, now believes that there was a Proto-Semitic language or a Proto-Indo-European language. You just chase things back as far as you can and infer things back as far as you can. But of course, the ancestry of all these matters is shrouded in mystery because there's no examples. So we don't have any actual writing before the Mesopotamian stuff in about 3,500 BC. Of course,
I'm going to sound very
came,
scholarly here, but
yeah,
I've got a cheat next to me. I picked up a book from the British Museum, in actual fact, and it talks of something called the Giza calendar.
yes. Well,
I don't know if
that's
you.
right. That's about 1,000 BC in date.
Oh, it
It's in
says
early
10th.
Hebrew, but it's
Yes, 10th
history.
century. That's right.
Yes,
Sorry,
in the history of the
misunderstood.
world, that's quite a late thing. But you see, the other thing, you said to me that you're interested in making your students think that
Yeah.
this is part of your job. Well, I had a professor who had the same idea that take nothing for granted. He said, if you read a cuneiform inscription, you look at the original source, you don't look at somebody's reading of it, you go back, you collate it, you check everything, you don't write anything, and you double check it, and all that stuff. And it was instilled into my mind in this rigorous way, and I believe it too. And I always try to follow the same kind of thing. So this is important. But the whole matter I was about to remark about with regard to this is that the following, that in archaeology as a general matter, people talk about the first X or Y or Z. So what they mean by that is the first X, Y, or Z, which we know, say, from archaeology. The first example of something appears at a date. Maybe you can say approximately or exactly what the date was, but all that is the first example known. The trouble about this is that when something is the first example known, very shortly thereafter, perhaps two books further on, the date of the first known becomes confused with when something began.
Yes.
And this is a crucial intellectual blunder because
Yes.
in
I
case of
agree.
writing, everybody will tell you there's probably no known writing before, say, 3,500 BC. But my own view is that probably it was 10,000 years older than that. I don't believe for a minute that it started the same week as the one which is the first known. And the important principle is that if you have a horizon with something which you can say in the 5th century BC, which is nearly 3,000 years ago, in the 5th century BC, it could have already had a history of 3,000 years then. So
Yes,
we don't really know anything about the order in which things were invented and what came first. It's a very elusive problem. But I think if I was an archaeology teacher, I would make this point regularly until people stop saying that things began in the 14th century, when in the 14th century we happen to see the first one. That's all it is.
Yes, I understand that. That makes very clear logical sense. So just to pull the threads together a little bit about when
Yes.
and where, can we be reasonably confident that writing, the first writing, began with cuneiform? Would that be your contention, or would you leave that as an open question?
Well, I would say, reiterating, the first example of writing that we have is from Mesopotamia, and we can see internally that it began with very primitive drawings, which evolved gradually until you had a phonetic system derived from the drawings, which allowed you to record these languages fluently. So by 3000 BC, there were people in Mesopotamia, they could listen to you speaking now, and they could transcribe what you say into cuneiform writing with ability. So it's a proper writing system with the two languages. The question is, what happened before? And the functions that inspire the creation of language are primarily commercial. They're to do with organization and trading. They're not to do with poetry and puns and literature. They came afterwards. So the received law in Mesopotamia is when you had these Sumerian city-states, more or less independent one from the other, with a large number of people controlled by a central administration and a temple in each place, and the organizing necessities about labor required complex memory and abacuses and all this kind of thing. Somebody else thought, oh, no, in this environment, writing will be indispensable. We invent numbers, we can control things, we can issue that, we can issue that. And so they link the first writing to the requirements of complex urban society with a central authority where things can't be done by word of mouth or memory. This is the basic principle.
So we're really starting all of that round about 3,500 BC.
And there are,
that's the earliest examples that we have. Okay,
yeah.
let's move on then to the content
Right.
of this script, because my understanding is we're sitting on something like tens of thousands of these cuneiform tablets.
That's
many
correct.
of which I understand haven't even yet been examined properly, because simply there's such a large number of them, I would guess.
Yeah.
So of the ones that we have looked at, you've mentioned that they contain business and poetry. What can we learn about their society, and how different is that society from our own, or how similar is it to our own?
Well, that's a whole big collection of big questions.
Sorry.
No, not in the least. No, it's very interesting to me. But the first thing is that you have a very literate culture, increasingly as time goes through the 3 millennia, because cuneiform beginning, say, before 3000 died out in about the 1st century AD. So you had 3 straight millennia of stuff. Within that period of time, the general perception is that writing literacy was not a general attainment, that there were schools where writing was taught, families who were writing families, boys who grew up in that kind of place went to school and learned to read and write. And so you have, as it were, the king, the administration, people around the army, important merchants, diviners, all these people use writing, but your man in the street and your man in the countryside probably didn't. So you have a high literacy in a proportion of the population which we cannot actually sort out, and it probably, practically speaking, illiteracy underneath it, and certainly a minority of people. So this is an important matter, because it means that all the evidence we have about thought and speculation and use of language comes from people who went to school and did it all. So all of the people who wrote are the people that we can hear speaking. So I don't myself think you can necessarily derive satisfactory evidence about the society in this ancient time and how it might or might not compare with modern society on the basis of archaeological material alone, because people ate and drank, they went to bed, they had things to pour water in, they had this, they had the razors, they had all that stuff. So they were like Homo sapiens in the basic requirements, but you can't penetrate the individual psychology really about anything from archaeology, broadly speaking. So if you're looking for an assessment of the individual, the person, or the community in antiquity, and the extent to which it's viable and respectable to compare it with modern man, we have to work with the writers and therefore the intelligentsia. So then we have to read what they wrote, not as historians looking for fact, but more like poets or university teachers or people like that who are trying to grab the people under the writing to see what's there, whether it is recognizable. Now, in my view,
do we know the proportion of the literate to the
don't.
illiterate? Because in our Middle Ages, for example, there was a very small proportion of literate people, usually the monks and scholastic kind of people.
Yes.
But today, the majority of people are literate. What was that society like? Was it just a very small number of literate people?
Well, I think it was a small number of people, because across the country, where people live in the countryside and went fishing and had boats and made chariots and all that, they probably couldn't read or write at all. And then you have the kids who went to school. You learned at the first level at school, you learned to read and write. You learned some of the classics, you learned the vocabulary, and you could do a job as a scribe. So you could marry somebody's daughter, keep the records and all that. That's a kind of low level. And then you have an intelligentsia level of people who practice the high disciplines, what we would call science and the arts, though not everybody would call them either, but thinkers and mathematicians, astronomers, astrologers, all those sorts of people depended on writing, and they had a great resource in materials that came from before. They were very respectful of collected knowledge and inscriptions, and then of course the king and the generals and all that. So I mean, I suppose if you had a big fishing net and you flew over Mesopotamia and scooped up 500 people in the net, I should think 3 of them would be literate.
Wow.
That's not exactly a scientific assessment.
Yeah.
Your question about whether we can use this source material to have a grasp of whether man is man in all ages, or whether the differences are huge, or what the compromised situation is. Well, there is a conspiracy in ancient studies to consider that the further you go back in time, the more unevolved the human race is. So the idea is that women in the Victorian period thought about nothing except sexual intercourse and wore uncomfortable clothes, and that the Romans only worried about bathrooms and underfloor heating. And before you know where you are, we're back with the cavemen, and the mind and the behavior and the outside evolved in great lumps. Like, this is complete nonsense, and it's something to be scrapped. But the corollary from it, what's inherited from it, is that you can never understand people in antiquity because they are so far away from us. The kind of
but you don't believe that,
top
do
of
you?
the soup. Pardon?
You don't believe that, do you?
I don't believe that. I don't believe it at all. And in this respect, I don't agree with many of my colleagues who don't use their imagination. They don't want to talk about humanity. They don't want to talk about somebody who wrote a letter being a human being, and to try and understand what they really meant and whether they were being sarcastic or whether they were being bashful, trying to squeeze out of the documents the person underneath. People say, you can't do this, you can't get it right. But the thing is, my working model is that Homo sapiens, you have the outside and the inside. And the outside allows for an extremely wide range of varieties of dress, code, eating, religion, gods, customs, habits, manners, laws. Everything can be satisfy your anthropology with a whole stamp collection of different types of human beings, which is what anthropology used to be like. But the other thing is the thing inside, which makes someone a Homo sapiens and not a gorilla. And my own view is that that inner quality is shared by all human beings and is unchanging. And it's certainly not evolving, and it may be going backwards, but it's certainly not evolving. So you have that constant. And that is the thing inside which I think one is entitled to look for. So
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I picked that up from one of your other books, because I was reading your fiction book, Writing in Stone.
oh, that, yes.
I haven't finished it yet, but at the end, I noticed you've got a statement where you make that statement very clear that the author's conviction remains that human nature in all its facets remains unchanged throughout time.
Yes.
There were psychopaths then, and like there were psychopaths now.
I believe that.
Yes, well, I think that's good, and I think that the evidence. I mean, I take the same view, and the evidence that I would adduce for that would be that when you do go back, maybe just a couple of thousand years, to times when people wrote more copiously, and you can read the writings of Aristotle or Cicero or people of that nature, they show the same kind of internal machinery that we have today, the same kind of thoughts, feelings, expressions. And there's no reason why that should stop with them.
No, and complexities in that the
Yeah.
human being is capable of believing things which are mutually contradictory. This is one thing. And another thing which is so significant is you had, these Roman inscriptions that were found, letters in colloquial Latin, and they were excavated recently from Vindolanda, and they're fantastic things. And things like, I can't remember the details. The general's wife said, "We've got to go to a party. We've got 20 minutes. And I got nothing to wear. What are we going to do?" Sort of letter. You only have to read one thing like that, and you lock into contact, which is of unmistakable clarity, because that letter is the thing that all married men have heard in their own houses, that situation, that exact situation, and many of the others too. And you only have to have that, or a letter where everyone's mourning over the pet that's died, or something like that. It's what you might call the archer's view of the world, because the archer's view of the world is obsessed with all that. But when you find it in antiquity, boy, does it have potency.
And do you find it in cuneiform?
I think you do. We have various things which you have to look at. One of them is there's a common type of correspondence in the business world, which is someone has sold something, barley, and they want the silver, and the silver hasn't come. So they write a letter, I've hello, are you my brother, or you're not my brother? You're my brother. I sent this. Where's this stuff? Where's this stuff? And the letter comes back saying, "Well, it's funny because I got your letter this morning, and it said you sent the barley, and you said that, and it's gone. And I just wrote to you the same day." So it's the letter in the post phenomenon.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's not a big deal. It's not a big deal, but the device is the crucial thing, the device, because everybody who takes recourse to that, especially when they do it for the first time, they think this is really ingenious because no one can prove that it didn't. That's how I'm let off, because then you grow up and you realize in the world that when you say the letters in the post, people laugh. But the essential truth of it is that that's a simple matter, which reveals all around it a whole load of things. It shows that people lend and they're not sure they're going to get the money back, and maybe they made a mistake and that they didn't charge enough, or they charged them, all this, and the people they're worried about all these things to do with the household and what's going to happen, and and men want their wives to have sons, and they're worried about that, and the survival of their name, and they're worried about disease, and they're worried about the gods, and when they're ill they pray to the gods every 5 minutes, and probably when they're not ill they don't think about it for 5 minutes to come. This
is like us today.
I think so. I mean, it is true that people turn to divine comfort in times of trouble. I mean, as a general rule, most people can go years on end without thinking about what's going to happen in heaven, and all of a sudden they get some serious message from the hospital, and they think, well, you know, and then they start taking it all seriously. And that's it. It's the scaffold effect that concentrates the mind. And I think that the default position of man is not to be in a state of religious awe. Now, there are a lot of religious texts from Egypt, there are a lot of religious texts from Mesopotamia, and the conclusion that you sometimes encounter is that they walked about in a state of religious trepidation, experience, apprehension, and so forth all the time. And if you read books about Egypt, you think all they cared about was dying, because we happen to have a lot of funeral material. But of course, that isn't true. And it's no more true of the Egyptians than it is of us. So the evidence that comes, you can either swallow the evidence and take it at face value and never ask any questions, or you can have a working model of the human being in the world, which is subject to the same. You have to have water, you have to have food, you don't want to get old, you know, all these things everybody has, even from the Paleolithic, and that's it. And then the other stuff is round the edge and not diagnostic about the inner person. So I think this is true. And of course, another thing is that people bury their dead from a very, very early age with objects. Now, I wrote a book about ghosts, and I got hung up with this matter because when a species like us dies, a member dies, the survivors mourn the dead. And this is not a human property, this is an animal property, because you only have to see one of these pictures of an elephant standing over a corpse of somebody else that they live with and mourn. You can see that there's grief. You can see it in and many things throughout the animal kingdom. So you can't say that mourning is a human property, it's an animal, alive property. But burying the dead with bits is a different matter. Because my understanding of it is, if somebody is buried, laid in the ground with things like a chisel, shoelaces, pots of this and that, and then covered over, that the understanding is that they're going somewhere, or part of them is going somewhere, where they will need that stuff. Either it symbolizes what they need, or they will actually use those things in the world to come. But my simple at junior school elementary mind believes that burial objects means afterlife. I just can't see any way around it. And the thing is, we already have burial objects with Neanderthals. So we certainly have them with human beings, as the borrowers used to call them. So this means that the conception that something happens to us after death and something survives somewhere and something goes somewhere, I think is hardwired into Homo sapiens from day one. So that is one of the things that everyone shares, and some religions say one thing and some another, but the basic situation is true, that people believe that they are not going to be annihilated when they die. At least people always have, and many, many people still do. And this is such a deep-seated thing that I regard it as one of the tokens of the inner human being that can't be eradicated. So, and it may be attributable to more than one explanation. It might be, I am so important, I can't bear the idea that I'm going to disappear. It may be something that simple. But in fact, there's hardly any evidence that you could find for a society, let alone a religion, where they don't believe that something happens to some part of the person when they're dead. Something goes somewhere. I mean, the church talks liberally about, well, your husband, the spirit of your husband's with the Almighty, that kind of thing. And it's a common expression on the lips of all sorts of persons of all religions that some measurable bit inside goes somewhere, and that's that. So maybe it's born again, maybe it isn't, that doesn't matter, but it's not ending with the chop. So this animates human beings on all sorts of levels, and it animates them, of course, with the question of ghosts, which is what I got so interested in, because my idea is, if Uncle Henry dies, gets very smelly, you stick him in the ground, and just in time, some thing which makes Uncle Henry come out of his ear and go away. If it goes from here to there, it can come back, because everything is reversible in that respect. So that seems to me that the conception of the ghost, the returning spirit of a dead person, matches the whole idea of the life, not life, the afterworld, the afterlife, the after something of a human being when they passed into the unknown. So I think that this is a mixed up ball of stuff, which is part of, I don't know, I wouldn't call it DNA. I don't know what it is. It's some component of the human thing. So if you look at it like that,
I mean, and that's therefore been present throughout pretty well every civilization from
I think
the earliest through to our own
to now,
day.
I would think so. So if you look at all the Egyptian stuff in the museum and all the books about Egypt and the emphasis on necessarily on graves and grave ritual and the paintings and everything like that, you can either see it as a unique thing, which is an Egyptian thing, or you can see it as the Egyptian expression of a common thing. There are two ways of looking at it, and I see it in the second way, that it's a particularly artistically interesting, imaginative, and well preserved, and so forth, manifestation of a general human matter. So I think you have to be careful in that you can't necessarily go beyond what a piece of evidence, a written text, much would go very far without losing control. I mean, for example, I've often tried to think about the magicians who practiced magic. They were cuneiform themselves. They had libraries of spells and incantations, and they healed the sick, and they did all sorts of things to benefit the world or benefit individuals. And
that's what your book is about, isn't it? The writing on the stone. It
that's a bit yeah, that's a strange thing, that book. Some people absolutely, somebody wrote about it on Amazon in such a derogatory way and threw it across the room and was disgusted. And I was really gratified to have such a response. I thought, heck, that would make me buy a book if I saw it myself. But I think
it's a very nice idea, really, where you have a natural phenomenon in stone, which is then interpreted by the people who write things as if it's a message from the gods, and you can take it on from that. I won't say any more about it, but that's
no. But I
interesting.
mean, somebody gave me that stone, and it looks like it's real cuneiform, but it's done by nature. And I just thought, what would have happened if Ashurbanipal, the king of Assyria, had got this stone? He'd have called in his exorcist. Look at this! Look at this! It's come down from heaven, and he wouldn't be able to read it because it was just, I mean, it'd be disastrous, wouldn't it?
But coming back to ghosts, then, so the Mesopotamians had a religion. They had gods. I believe one of them was called Marduk.
Yep, that's right.
I'm not sure where later on. I know that Darius and they had a different kind of religion, didn't they?
The Persians did. Yes,
Ahura Mazda, I think, was
that's right.
yeah.
Yes, they did. They had a different religion when they arrived, when they came along. But the old Babylonian religion, we know quite a lot about it because we have so many texts over such a long period of time. But there was a big pantheon of gods. Some of them were Sumerian, very old ones, and then there were Babylonian ones, and then they were identified one to the other. So there was a big pantheon organized in a rather civil service way, with numbers 1, 2, and 3 on top, and then the lesser ones with responsibilities and their wives and their children. And there was a sort of massive, great phone book with all the names. And there were hundreds of gods, and some of them are very obscure.
But the ordinary person then would obviously believed in some kind of afterlife.
I think, yes.
In that afterlife, they would have gone to be with those gods, or lived in that realm.
No, that doesn't exist. It's a bit complicated. You have there is a netherworld, and when people were dead, they were buried in the ground, and the bit that comes out thing is what we call a ghost or a spirit, went down to the underworld where it had to stay. And it was gloomy there and dusty, and they hung about. And it's a bit like really rather like King's Cross Station at 5 o'clock on a Friday evening. Hundreds of people hanging around waiting for Lord knows what, because it wasn't quite clear to them what they were waiting for. But they didn't have limbo. This is really an important and wonderful thing. They didn't have limbo, and they didn't have heaven and hell. They had a waiting room, and it's been a mystery for a long time about what this waiting room was for. But I've come to the conclusion, on the basis of the most delicate and esoteric kind of writing, that this was the idea, that the quantity of human life, the thing that animated human beings, so you had blood and you had clay and you had the human spirit, that the human spirit, which animates the person and which goes down there after the body, the clay and stuff rots away, it was finite in quantity. That is to say, I think the underlying principle was the following, that for a new baby to come into the world, some old, useless and redundant person or whatever it was had to die, because there was a balance like this, so that when somebody died, the ageless and timeless spirit was available. And all the waiting ghosts, all the waiting spirits were locked in the basement. And everybody has understood it to mean they were locked in to keep them there. But I think it's the other way round. They were locked in so that one could be released when it was needed. And when there was a kind of vacancy, a spirit would animate a new infant in a new...
That suggests a form of reincarnation, then.
Well, I think not. I'm frightened of the word reincarnation because I think it's the raw material. That's to say, I don't think that somebody would grow up and remember they'd been in the Sumerian army and gone to Iran when they were 15 in an earlier life or something like that. I think what happens is it's all poured into it, so to speak, a bath, and then a drop is taken for a new baby. So it's recycling rather than reincarnation. I think if the Mesopotamian, especially the thinkers, there were some very esoteric and learned persons, if they believed that reincarnation took place in the human species, they would jolly well talk about it, and there's not a whisper. So I think it's source material, and I think that it has an explicable origin, because I think water in Mesopotamia, the Euphrates and Tigris rivers with which we started out, the source material, the sources for those was out of control of the Mesopotamians. It was far in the mountains and beyond their control. And so the balance between adequate water, drought and flooding was crucial. It's why we have the flood myth and all sorts of other things. And that the idea that life was something like water, which had to be protected and not wasted and recycled and utilized, is something to do with this conception that human life is the same idea. It's rather fanciful. I don't know that we could prove it. But one thing it did strike me is that the idea that you had an idea, that the idea that you had a principle that someone's life had to finish before a new baby could be born, would be an extremely fertile principle to use in talking to somebody if you were a visitor in one such place, people who were about to die of cancer and who were thinking about all these things in my life, what's going to happen and all that. And the idea that when you surrender that animation inside you, that it will someday come out as another baby, not your family, not your descendant, but just that the stuff would be responsible for a new life on that level, was very stimulating and comforting sort of idea. It's a very human idea. And I think that the evidence is enough to make it clear, because otherwise, when people died and they went down to the waiting room, that it would get more and more and more crowded. I mean, millions of them, and what are they going to do? And they're supposed to eat dust and drink dirty water, and there's never enough dirty water down there. And if they were really there forever, all the ghosts would find a way to come back and pull people's hair and get their own back, because it would be so horrible. So I think there must be a logic behind it, a system behind it. And I think that's it. And it's a rather magnificent conception, I think.
Well, it works well if you've got an increasing population. I mean, at the moment, I believe the population rate or the fertility rate in Europe, for example, is declining. We're less than replacement rate. You'd have many more people stuck in that room, I think, as fewer and fewer babies are being born. But can I move us on away from the religious side
Yes, of course.
to the scientific and maybe the mathematical side? I've seen that there are cuneiform tablets which surprised me by having Pythagorean triples on them and
Yes.
other scientific kind of elements. There's maps of the world and all kinds of things like. Could you say something about their scientific knowledge or the mathematical
Yes.
knowledge?
As far as I can, I will. The first thing is that when writing appeared in this early time, so did numbers. So side by side with the first writing and the ability to make records, numbers appeared, cuneiform numbers appeared. So you could write the numbers 1 up until infinity. So the two evolved together. And what came out of it in Mesopotamia was a sexagesimal system. That's to say, not decimal like ours. And mathematicians whom I know have said to me that 60 is a more fertile and creative number for many mathematical reasons than 10. So it doesn't surprise them at all.
Yeah.
So with this base, you have one wedge is 1, 2 wedges is 2, all the way up to there's another sign for 10, and then 10 plus 1, all the way up to 100, and all the way up to as far as you can go. So they did very complicated division and multiplication and all manner of stuff, which is far over my head, but they were very nimble with these numbers, very nimble indeed. So they could do complex mathematics. But the main points to stress, I think, are that the scribe who went to school learnt the use of numbers from the beginning. So writing and numeracy went together. So, and one of the things they did in school was they had to make answer quite mathematical questions, geometrical questions, and calculations of the number of bricks in a wall, and all sorts of practical things like that. So when they were in the world, if they worked with architects or they did all those kind of things, that they would be able to keep up with the mathematics. So when you left the training, you had a facility in mathematics as well as a facility in writing. So that there's a kind of base among all those who were writers of the same kind of thing. But over and above that, there was any amount of speculation, calculation, and cleverness, which took things to a quite remarkable level. So, for example, astronomy achieved extraordinary things in Mesopotamia, and the process involved was observation and the collection of data over long periods of time from which they extrapolated principles. So it was a welcome intellectual process, and the collection of data was, for example, much vested in the first visibility of things at the horizon and the last visibility of things, so that they made long records of this over months and then years and so forth, to the point that they were able to predict eclipses accurately. Wow. That kind of stuff. And many other things as well, because they knew that they had a conception that the sun moved along the ecliptic. They knew the signs of the zodiac forming constellations and the planets and the different movements of them and so forth. And that the higher intellectual members of this craft were able to eventually synthesize their findings into matters which I think were taken by the Greeks who went to Babylonia and studied there into Greek astronomy and mathematics themselves. So I'm I come from a long family of people who can hardly count above the number 3. So I'm hardly the person to expound on this, but I know that it's very quick if I look into this stuff, they go over my head because it's serious grown-up stuff. And serious grown-up mathematicians write about it and claim that Pythagoras' theorem was already anticipated by the Babylonians. I think that's true, but I'm not 100% sure. But what I can say is something which is not so obvious, that the principle of this mathematics, of mathematical astronomy, was predicated on precise measurements of observations and the movements they can observe in the sky. And the origin of this and how it became so important is to be attributed to the fact that in ancient Mesopotamia, there was no pollution.
Well,
so that when you went to bed and slept on the roof and you lay with your head on your hands and looked up at the sky, you saw everything with brilliant clarity. The pole star, the Milky Way, things that were here, things that were there. And when intelligent people did this, as they grew up, they knew the night sky eventually like the back of their own hands, because there was nothing else to look at. There were no street lights and no illuminations. And everything was highly, it was like a drive-in movie, a free drive-in movie. So you would look at it and everything would be familiar, and this would be identified, the constellation with this, and that would be this god, and some people knew this and some people knew that. But the intelligent ones who started it all see something and they thought, heck, wasn't that over there before? And you only want one person, one thinker to say, how can that be? And I think they knew they were on a ball, a globe. I think they did, extrapolating from the moon. I think they did. And it depends on the period of time you're talking. But you have this thing that willy-nilly, an intelligent person would be thinking about these matters because they had a basic working plan that the map of the heavens was the mirror of the world, and that things that happened in the one affected the things below, and they mirrored what happened, and there were equivalents of what happened, and the gods were up there and they watched over the world and they interfered or they didn't interfere. And it's a very subtle interplay of things which varied from period to period. But that is
so there's a kind of a crossover between astrology and astronomy.
Well, in principle, you could say that, but the fact is that I think astronomical data, which was much more important, took shape before astrology, because the astrology was predicated on what the astronomers told them was there. And with their movements in their 60s and their idea of good and bad and what have you, you can easily see how off on the back of the fabric of observation and idea that astrology, which appeals to a hungry need for mankind and that tries to answer it in a nice, comfortable, and probably meaningless way, grew up on the back of it and became heavily entrenched. And the Babylonians invented the zodiac, the 12-point zodiac. That's where it comes from. So we've inherited from them astrology and the zodiac, which any cheap newspaper, you can open it and find out today. It's never gone away. It's an amazing.
It's still there. We're coming to the end of our talk, but I just wanted to give you ask you this question, if I may, to kind of conclude with, and that is, you really stand in a very fortunate position. You said at the beginning you stand in an important position that you've been able to do the job which you enjoy doing, but you're also fortunate, it seems to me, in the sense that you can immerse yourself in the civilization which is entirely separate from our own and separated by time and distance. And that gives you a great perspective across civilizations, which most people don't have. Most people are very narrowly focused in their own time and their own space and their own sphere. I wondered, how's that wider perspective, that knowledge of other civilizations, given you any insight into our own civilization and the way it's going? And are there any lessons maybe which the Babylonians or the Assyrians or Sumerians could have easily taught us and which we've probably forgotten about, but which we ought to take more cognizance of today? Are there things perhaps which maybe they could still teach us if we had the opportunity to learn from them? What would you point us towards as something which maybe
Well,
they might be helpful to us?
in the first instance, I've always had the idea of a Martian landing on the globe with a notebook, told to write up, to analyze what's going on in the world. So when I look at the Babylonians, I try to be sympathetic to them. I don't try to be one, but I try to look at them from the outside with as much sympathy as possible for what they really are. So that's one of the reasons why I feel they are close to us in the sense of being the same species, subject to the same matters. So one thing I would say that looking at history in an overall sweep from the beginning of writing up until now, there are certain lessons which I suppose any fool would derive from it, and I don't know how valid they are in terms of a defensible intellectual proposition. But one of them is that the human race is very, very, very slow to learn from its mistakes.
Mm.
And I find this astonishing that, for example, that since it's often been that the intelligentsia have had positions of respect and sometimes control in the history of the world, that there's never been an agreement among everybody that there's no point in ever having a war. I mean, wars have probably been going on since the Paleolithic. They're going on right now, and we're no better off. So if I'm a Martian and I look at what's going on reported in the world, and the wars that are going on in the world, and the wars that everybody's expecting in the world, I would be flatly incredible. Haven't they learned yet that it doesn't do any
The
good?
answer is no.
So if you start looking for lessons from the past in that respect, it's hopeless. I mean, I say this, that human beings have never got more intelligent, that their quotient of brain is not increased, and that they've never thrown off the fuzziness of unsuccessful, clumsy, and unacceptable religious nonsense. And so they are, in a way, still crawling about under the sun in a rather pathetic fashion, and that there's never been enough sympathy for striking the individual people whose voices don't fulfill what everybody expects. They get trodden down, they get ignored, they're not allowed to open their mouths. So all in all, the record, in my own view, is not so inspiring. And there's kindness and unkindness and adultery and faithfulness and lies and truth all the way through in probably the same quantity as they exist now. And the capacity for bullies and fanatics to ruin everybody else's life, same as it was. So it's a bit difficult to say, well, you know, the Babylonians, if I were you, I wouldn't do that anymore, or something like that. I mean, they liked alcohol, they made beer and strong beer, and they drank it, and they liked music and dance, and like having lots of children. And you know, I don't know, it's probably not, everything is not true of all the races and peoples all around the world, that they're exactly the same. They're not exactly the same, but the underlying principles, I think, are true. And I'm not sure what we would learn from them. I've always hoped in the gallery that we have a black diorite sculpture of King Gudea, who was a Sumerian ruler from about 2300. He spoke Sumerian, which is this very dead language and quite difficult. And I've often hoped that if I lingered by the sculpture and dusted the back of his neck, because sometimes there's dust on the back of his neck, and said, "How are you doing? I want to ask you something about Sumerian magic," that one day he'd turn around and say, "Son, ask me what you want and I'll tell you," but it's never happened. So I think that's a bit disappointing, because the thing that I would learn, is all the things on tablets I don't understand. I'd love to have an afternoon with one of those guys from the Babylonian University who was an astronomer and a lexicographer and a medical doctor and all that. I want to sit, okay, what is this sign? I can never read this sign. That would be marvelous. One day that will happen.
Dr. Irving Finkel, thank you ever so much for a very fascinating and wonderful conversation. Thank you very much indeed.
Big pleasure. Thank you, sir.